Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. What an honor it is to be here. I'm actually sitting right in the middle of one of my vineyards at my baby's brand, Aperture Cellars, where we actually make all my wines from exposed, Aperture, Devil Proof, and all my projects are made right here. And I am, let me take you on a little tour, give you a little bit better reference. And from the very get-go, as I already have, please open up your wine, start enjoying it, because I am a lot more interesting if you've had a few glasses of wine in you. And I'll take you out to the vineyards. It's a beautiful day out here in Sonoma County. So let's go on a little tour. So beautiful day out here. I'm going to take you out into one of our young blocks of Cabernet as things are cranking out here with this beautiful weather. We were in the low, got to just about 90 degrees today. And this vineyard block here is Cabernet Sauvignon. You can see all this amazing, beautiful gravel, very well drained soils here. And it's actually a lot of volcanic soils in here as well. And we've gone through just this week, you can see some of the material on the floor. We've gone through for these young vines and just made sure that everything that was remaining, we call it in winemaking and viticulture suckering, and we go through and make sure everything that's remaining is going to be the canes that will actually hold some fruit and be the infrastructure for next year. And you can see these little baby clusters. Welcome 2021 harvest. And I'm guessing we're probably about 2 weeks out from flowering. Vines are all self-pollinating, so it doesn't need another vineyard or another vine to pollinate, but this cluster will start to expand a little bit further, and you'll see all these little white caps on here. That's a really critical time because that's really where the fruit set and how that cluster formation will look for the rest of that season. And you can kind of see where everything's waking up. A lot of the young vines surrounding us here right now, but we have, might be a little hard to see from here, but we have vineyards all the way around here. That is the brand new state-of-the-art winery here at Aperture Cellars, my brand that I started back in 2009 as a partnership with my father. And I'm here sitting at our hospitality space, which we have all to ourselves because we are closed on Tuesdays and Wednesdays here. But I thought this would be a good way, let me flip this around, to show you why and how I got into winemaking. Here's our beautiful hospitality space. And as you can see, whether you have a bottle of exposed in front of you or Aperture or whatever you may be drinking of mine, usually photography is a big influencer in mine. Here's all the current bottlings and labels of my own personal brand, Aperture Cellars. And you can see all these images are different images of my father's from all over the world. And if you look at exposed, we wanted to go with something very unique and austere for the image on exposed label, but that's one of my father's older images where we have some more of his newer images here. And he's, my father's been a photographer most of his life. He knew he wanted to be a photographer since the age of 13 and started doing album covers for like Doobie Brothers and Dan Fogelberg. And now he's done 17 books and 12 of them on wine. This is the one that he did on Sonoma. And if you can see, we recreated the Aperture right above us as well. But let me flip this around here. You can see, so this is actually a skylight in the ceiling of the winery and hospitality space here, here at Aperture Cellars. But I'm gonna flip over to my main screen here, and you can see we have all these different, I hope you all get a chance to come visit us. We have all these different amazing private rooms here at Aperture Cellars. And that have a lot of different areas that you can have very intimate one-on-one tastings or private tastings. And I'm going to close this and hop onto my other computer where we can dive into enjoying some wines. So give me 1 second here. I'm back. I hope everyone can hear me. Please send me a message if you can't. But how I got into wine, as you can see, photography was a very big influencer in that. with my father starting to do books on wine in my early teens, I was really fortunate because I'm not born into a wine family. I'm the first winemaker in my entire family. And my introduction was through travel and through my father's work. And while he was doing his books on wine, my family and I traveled all over the world. And by the time I was 18, I had traveled to over 80 countries with my family. But really from my early teens on was all in different wine regions. And my dad has done books on Tuscany and Burgundy and Bordeaux and Napa and Sonoma and Oregon and all over. And I had an amazing childhood being an only child, getting to travel all over the world with my family. Oh, sorry, I just wanted to make sure everyone could hear me. Getting to travel all over the world with my family and visiting these different wine regions. And if you're sitting in the old world in Italy or France, they pour you a little glass of wine and introduce it to you as part of the culture and part of the food of the region. And so from very early on, truly, I had the opportunity to taste these world-class wines all over the world. And I had a huge appreciation for how the place had such a distinct influence on that final wine and final product. In particular, when we were living in Burgundy, it was very easy for me to understand that the white wine is almost always Chardonnay, the red wine being Pinot Noir, but how vastly different that same grape could be from the same vintage, just going from village to village. And that essence of a place having that unique thumbprint on that final product was very fascinating to me at a very early age. But going back to Colorado, I knew I was going to be fascinated with wine, but not ever thinking that I had the potential of being a winemaker, because it really seemed like it had to be passed down generation to generation. I went out to school in California for business. And I went to Santa Barbara, and I was, again, still very fascinated with the art of wine. And I needed a summer job, so I founded the closest winery to me, which was Fess Parker Winery. And I had my first internship there when I was 18 years old. And that was very influential for me. One, getting to see kind of the different roles of winemaking, that there was words like viticulture, which was this Bachelor of Science in wine growing on the vineyard side, and enology, the fermentation science, focusing on winemaking that I had never even heard of. And so I started researching these more and more. And after I got my degree in business, I had actually had started researching schools. And we have two of the best schools in the world for winemaking at here in California. One being in UC Davis and the other at Fresno State. And I got into both schools, but I decided to go to Fresno State over Davis because at the time it was the only one that had a full working winery on campus. So I was able to leave school, work in the winery, get my feet and hands and everything dirty in the winery, while at the same time getting my theoretical background in the classroom. And it was an incredible experience. And during that time, I fell in love with Bordeaux varietals. And from there on out, as soon as I got my degrees, I have traveled all over the world focusing on Bordeaux varietals. And I would spend the early part of my career spending half the time in the Southern Hemisphere, getting to really focus on varietals like Malbec. And I worked for winemakers like Paul Hobbs at his winery at Vinacobos in Mendoza, for the Argiano and Sassicaia families of Italy that had small projects in Patagonia, Argentina called Bodega Neomia, Bodega Chacra. Always coming back to California. And for the most part, I was living and working in Napa Valley and getting to work with some spectacular winemakers like Bob Foley, who was the winemaker for Pride for many years. And I was working on his own projects, Robert Foley, Hourglass, and Switchback Ridge. And then I went out to Bordeaux to focus on the varietal Merlot. And I was studying on the right bank at Chateau Petrus and really fell in love with the region and area, and have gone back essentially every year since last year, since then, to work with our different cooperages and go see my friends that I got to learn and study from. And then I started my own brand, Aperture Cellars, back in 2009 while I was still at Screaming Eagle. And I've gone on to make wine for a lot of different other folks, but I have, in 2019, finished the brand new state-of-the-art winery that we just were overlooking. And I say this is state-of-the-art. It truly is one of the most state-of-the-art wineries on the world. There's no place that I've ever worked at, ever seen, that I'd rather make wine at than here at my custom winery. We have all the bells and whistles that I've always dreamt about, and I've designed 3 wineries, but this really, I wanted to create something in a no holds bar kind of look at how we could do something quality first. And we have a lot of different toys that most winemakers don't have.
from 5 different temperature controlled rooms to take, whether it's the grapes and keep them nice and chilled, to take fermentations and direct them in different ways, as we're starting to look through not only just the primary fermentation of the sugars turning into alcohol, but the secondary fermentations of what we call malolactic fermentation of this acid, malic acid, which you normally find in green apples, to lactic acid, which you can find in butter, softer acid. Almost all red wines you've ever tasted go through this process, but everything we do here is all native. So we don't add any commercial yeast for the fermentation or commercial bacteria for the secondary fermentation. So we really need temperature to kind of help guide us through this natural process. Beyond that, we have 3 different sorting tables feeding into our optical sorting, which if you have never had the opportunity, it's well worth coming out and visiting wineries during harvest. And not every winery, very few of them actually have it, but there's this amazing piece of equipment for red wines that after we go through the full cluster sorting, through destemming, where it takes all the berries off of it, it goes through another sorting table, and then finishes off with this piece of equipment that takes a photo of every single berry. And and I can type in exactly which variety. We're working with Cabernet Sauvignon, and it was a warm vintage, so I'm worried about all the raisins and getting too high of alcohol. We can kind of type that into this computer, and it takes a photo of the shape, size, and color. And if it doesn't fit into the parameters that I have designated for that, we have 15 air guns that kick it out and goes. And when we're going, we can do this about 6 to 8 tons per hour. It sounds like a machine gun, and just kicking out anything that's not perfect. When I was at Screaming Eagle, for instance, we had about 16 people on the sorting line doing this by hand, about 1/3 of the speed, if not even a little bit slower, and we weren't able to get as high quality product as we are with this amazing piece of equipment and all the other pieces of equipment that lead up to this. And then it goes into all these custom tanks that we have automated pump overs. We have a computer and a pump in every single one of our tanks, and we're able to control the fermentation because the soul of a red wine comes from those skins. If you squeeze the Cabernet berry, actually the pulp is clear. It's a white pulp. But this color, this beautiful color that we're working with, the tannins, most of the aromatics and flavors are actually all coming from the skins. And so we need to extract those skins. And when fermentation starts, they actually all rise to the top of the tank because of CO2 is a byproduct of fermentation, and that being released all pushes the skins to the top. So what we actually do is in the wine industry, it's called a pump over, where we're pumping the juice or the wine at the bottom of the tank to the top to mix up and push all those skins back down into the fermentation and run this juice through these skins, almost like a funnel through these to get through that extraction. That will happen, and depending on the vintage, varietal, 3 to 4 weeks it's on skins. And then with this automated pump over system, before I was able to do extractions about 2 to 3 times a day, depending on if everyone showed up, how many other tanks we had to ferment. But pretty much we'd start with morning pump overs, have a pump, do the pump over, sanitize it, go to the next one, do the next one. And you do that pretty much for about 16 hours straight. Now I can do it however often I want, when I want, throughout the evening. And when the grapes first come in, we do 72 pump overs in the first 3 days. So it's really kind of expanded my ability for extraction and the creativity part of winemaking in a whole different way that I've never had the option to. After that process, it all goes to barrel. 100% of all my wines, even my white wines that I make and consult for, all have some sort of barrel influence. And for the reds, let's focus on those right now. They will age there for about 18 to 24 months. The 2018 Expose was in there for 2 years, and it will age there and not only pick up some of the oak impact, and we're very, very particular on our barrels. It's all from the center of France with very, very tight grain, and usually doing light to medium plus toasting on that, which is a very, very light, subtle toasting. But it's also softening up the tannins, building structure, giving the wines a natural way of settling out and aging. After that process, we'll bottle it. And thanks to everyone here and many of the angels, this new project has just been a dream because I get to really kind of expand my creativity. And for Aperture, most of our vineyards are estate vineyards. it's the crews that we have here farming our vineyards, whether they're here at the estate or some of our hillside stuff in Alexander Valley. This new project gave me the ability to work with a lot of new amazing winemakers, a lot of new amazing viticulturists and grape growers like Cam Mortson of the Mortson family and Jerry Reedy, and work with these unique sites that I've wanted to be working with for a while and create something new and unique just for you all. The only way you can get exposed is through the Naked website, and it's just for Angels. So greatly appreciate the support. But please, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but if you have any questions, I'm going to leave about 10 or 15 minutes at the end, and Kim is going to ask me all your questions. So feel free to type them away, and I'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. But definitely want to make sure we have a great question and answer at the end. So you've heard me speak way too much. I hope you've been drinking during all this. Let's dive into the very inaugural vintage 2018 Exposed. And this is one of my father's unique photos. And really, I wanted to show something in black and white, something very, very unique. And so on the back of this bottle, Exposed, we kind of wanted to play on the word. So Exposed, there's a lot of different plays here. One of which being the exposure. What the light is on the film changes the image. What the light on the clusters, what the grapes are exposed to, what people are exposed to, who you're exposed to, it all changes who you are. And hopefully who you consume this with, enjoy this bottle with, what you eat it with, all changes who your enjoyment level on that as well. But the 2018 Exposed is all from some of these unique vineyard sites in Alexander Valley, which is kind of where my heart has brought me. During my winemaking experience, and you've heard that I've worked all over the world, from Bordeaux to Argentina to Napa, I came over to Sonoma, and this is where I live, and this is my home, for a very particular reason. One, the barrier of entry for a young winemaker who's not born into Napa Valley is quite difficult. The grape prices are just 2, 3, sometimes 4 times the price of what we're able to work with here. And that is also related in the land prices as well. And being a son of a photographer and my mother's a nurse, diving into that market was very, very difficult. And at the same time, I started to see having these warmer and warmer vintages and more severe droughts. We're living in probably the most extreme one we've seen in a long time. 2015 was the most extreme one that I've seen in the last couple decades. This is surpassing that. I think we're only about 12 inches of rain here, which is about a tenth or 15 or 0.15% of, or 15% of what we're normally used to in this region. And as we start to see these more extreme weather patterns, and heat certainly has a huge influence. And usually what we're worried about in this luxury area of winemaking in Napa and Sonoma is not the rains, it's not the hail, but it's normally heat spikes. And why I decided very intentionally to move most of my production over to Sonoma and to Alexander Valley. I still consult for brands in Napa and think it's one of the great wine growing regions in the world, but I also think Alexander Valley is second to none as well. It just gives you a different style because it's a little bit cooler over here. Where we're situated right now, we have hillsides to the east of us where a lot of this fruit came from. But if you head west, there's no mountain range between us and the Pacific Ocean. And that Pacific Ocean is a cold body of water, averaging right around 53 degrees Fahrenheit year round. And that has a huge influence on this amazing region. And so what that does is it really cools things down at night. And so our diurnal swings, the heat of the day to the cool of the night, can be 40, 50 degree swings in the extreme parts of our summer. And so it gets warm here, don't get me wrong. We get 90 up to 100 degrees, and we've even seen like stretches in last year that we had weeks in the low hundreds here. If we're having that temperature here, add 5 to 10 degrees warmer in the Napa Valley. So it's even more extreme there. But the biggest difference is our nights will be about 10 to 15 degrees cooler here than what you would see in Napa Valley. So that really gives the vine the ability to cool down at night, rebound from that extreme heat. And also because it's cooling down quite a bit quicker and more extreme, it doesn't heat up as quick. And when it cools down quicker. So that peak temperature where we're worried the crop might burn, we might start to see dehydration. It's a shorter duration because of that coastal influence. And the the fog patterns that we have from the Pacific Ocean. So that was one of the main reasons. But beyond all that, right, we have wonderful climate out here. We also have some of the most spectacular soils, aspects, and sites, and what kind of the French, and certainly a true believer myself, terroir in this area. Amazing volcanic soils, and that's really where most of the vineyard sites for exposed here are coming from, are these amazing deep volcanic soils. And why that's so important is the volcanic soils are really well drained. And a key part to luxury Cabernet winemaking, and to make the best of the best, is to get enough stress on that vine before veraison. So what I just showed you out there in the vineyard, we're right in between, we're getting ready for flowering, and then it would be set. After set, we'll have these really, really small kind of pea-sized green berries. The next phase is called veraison, where those green pea-sized berries go from that color to red in red varietals. And during that time, if you get enough hydric stress on your vineyard, you're actually able to shrink the berry size down and the cluster size down significantly. Doing that shrinks your, when you're able to do that, you increase your skin to juice ratio significantly. And like I was saying earlier, the soul of that red wine is that skin. So if you're able to shrink those clusters, those berries, you're going to have a lot more skin per volume. And that's going to give you a more expressive exploration of that site and a more rich style of wine. So these volcanic soils, and also there's not a lot of organic material in those soils. So it makes the vine struggle a little bit. And we work with sites that we don't irrigate whatsoever, that are truly dry farmed, even in extreme conditions like this, because those vines will really shoot really, really deep in the soils and are able to pull different water sources, different mineralities, and different expressions from just the top soils that you would think of most crops. We found vineyard rooting depth of 30 feet in some of our vineyards. So it's a really interesting way of getting a vast expansion of and a buffering of the vine's capability to work through these extreme stresses and pull different interesting elements out of the soil. So that's really what brought me over here. And as we've started to see these more and more extreme vintages with heat and droughts and everything, some of my favorite sites on the planet that I've ever worked with are right here in Sonoma County in Alexander Valley. And so this has been a really fun project to create these wines that I really get to work with different growers and get back to kind of my creativity of putting together different blends and different things that are really exciting, specifically just for the Angels here. So let's dive into the wine. As you can see, we have this beautiful, rich, dark color. And this is a 2018. So we just released this, as many of you know, so it's still a baby. This has plenty of longevity behind it. And I would strongly suggest, if you have the opportunity, to decant this a few hours ahead of enjoyment. If you don't, no worries. If you pop this as I started speaking and have tasted it throughout, you'll see how it starts to open up and evolve. And what will happen with this wine, with some age and with some oxygen, is when you first pull the cork, it might be a little bit tight. It just have gone through this, long process of being in this very reductive container with not a lot of oxygen. Now it's starting to be able to breathe again and have some more life brought to it. You'll start to see some of these aromatics. Let's dive into this. I don't have many of these in my cellar, so I'll have to order some more myself. But because we're pulling from cooler sites for Cabernet Sauvignon than you classically would think in the luxury tiers of wine of Napa in these areas, you get a little bit more delicate wines as well, a little bit more floral, a little bit more of those kind of beautiful red fruits that I'm picking up here. But a lot of lavender and violet. And you get some black cherry, some blackberry, and then a little hint of kind of spice and a little like sandalwood or cedar box. And I think that's just a touch of the hint of the oak. We only use about 50% new barrels on this. The other have been used for 2 or 3 other vintages just to give body and richness, because we don't want to overpower this amazing fruit that we're getting to work with. But sometimes a little bit of that goes a long way and can fill in some of these unique complexities that the fruit doesn't naturally come with. Let's dive into it. And from the very get-go, even with this being a baby, you can see how mature and soft those tannins are. Because we're able to grow in these slightly cooler areas, we get about 2 to 3 weeks longer of hang time or maturity of those clusters staying on the vine than in these warmer regions. So with that extra time and those cooler nights, we're not pushing the alcohol necessarily, but we're letting it sit on the vine to get more mature tannins. And what that does, not all tannins are created equally. You can see tannins, and I'm sure you've had these wines that are big smack in the face, and you need have to have some sort of food to go with them, because otherwise your mouth just starts puckering. This wine will pair beautifully with food, and I'll talk about some of my favorite pairings in a second. But you can also just see right now, have a sip, it just glides across the palate. It's silk, very lengthy, and for the folks who it's really been an honor and a pleasure getting to read all the comments so far. I'm overwhelmed by the response. It's really exciting, but you can see how well and how special and unique that texture is. Just glides across, but it leaves your, for me on the finish, it's still bright. It leaves your mouth watering a little bit and almost wanting for another sip or another bite of food. And for me, because this, don't get me wrong, this is still a very rich, layered Cabernet Sauvignon from a lot of different amazing vineyard sites, some being hillside, which really kind of concentrate that. But there's still brightness, freshness in this wine. So you have a little bit more wide variety of pairings as well. You can certainly go to the classic pairing of, a T-bone or a filet mignon with this. It would go spectacular. But I also love a rack of lamb with like a rosemary crusted, a little bit of salt on there, some fresh cracked pepper. And you can even go duck or pork on this one, because it doesn't have too much overpowering tannins and they're so mature and soft and elegant. It will really kind of pair with a lot of different styles of foods. So I encourage you to all pop this, have some while you're cooking, taste, and you don't have to think as classic as you normally would with a California Cabernet. You can broaden your span there a little bit. And please send me some notes on what you all are pairing with this. And if you've already done it, please let me know now. I'm really excited. But I just opened this up. I didn't follow my own advice of decanting. I opened this up about 5 minutes before this whole thing. So even now, giving another 5 minutes, you can see it's starting to open up and more. I get a lot of these really beautiful raspberry notes, that bright red fruit characteristics. There's some blackberry. There's some beautiful, nice, lengthy spice on there. A little touch of like dark chocolate, maybe a hint of caramel, but all tied in together. Really fun, pleasurable wine, and such an honor to be able to share this with you. So cheers. I hope you all are drinking. If you're not drinking this, let me know what you are drinking, because it is 5 o'clock somewhere and we should all be enjoying this virtual tasting as we dive through this. Yeah, what else can I say about this? I want to open it up to question and answers at some point here soon. And I've been seeing a lot of questions down there, so I don't want to cut anyone short. And I know I've thrown a lot of information at you all, but I encourage you all to come out. And if you all plan to visit California or live in this area, please come visit us here at Aperture Cellars. We're just outside of the town of Healdsburg. Exposed will not be poured here. It's purely just for Naked and just for the Angels, but it's fun to kind of see a wide span of my work, no matter what you're loving right now. But Exposed will be purely just for Naked wines, and available now on the website that we just launched about with this SKU, just launched, I think, about 3 weeks ago. But I see over 77 questions, so I don't want to cut this short, and I know I've thrown a lot of information, and questions will turn into further conversation. So Kim, if you're ready, I'm ready to hop into some questions.
Let's do it.
And if you have any questions, Kim, I'm here for you too.
Of course I do. Cool. Well, just to start off, we do have a quick one here. Would you explain what tannins are to everybody?
Yes, great question. So tannins are the texture in wine, essentially. There's a lot of other things that can go into the balance of how those tannins play on your palate. But think about if you've ever over-steeped a bag of tea in a hot water and it's starting to get bitter. That's actually a tannin. Tannins are officially an acid, but it's the texture that gives the red wines the layers and the richness that the wine has. And tannin can be beautiful and silky and kind of glide across the palate, show the structure of the wine. It can be very bitter and overpowering and drying. Not all tannin is created equally. So it is really kind of the pigment and the texture of the wine is the best way to describe it.
Awesome. It's what makes your mouth water, right?
Or yeah, water or pucker, or the tannin can give you a lot of different textures, but yes.
Awesome. So Bruno actually had a couple of great questions for you. So to start off, what region in Europe does Sonoma and Napa most compare to?
Well, Sonoma alone is probably one of the most diverse regions on the planet, if not the most. So you really can't say one region for Napa and Sonoma, because those are vastly different alone as well. Sonoma, if you look at all of Sonoma, we have areas that are cooler than Champagne, France, as you get closer and closer to the Pacific Oceans, and areas that are on par, and depending on the vintage, sometimes a little warmer than Bordeaux. So we really have a wide variety of everything from Champagne to Bordeaux, all in one region in Sonoma County here. Where we're working with is really more in the eastern part that gets a little bit warmer days to give us this beautiful, rich, ripe fruit characteristics, those ripe, lush tannins that kind of glide across your palate. Those cool nights kind of keep that natural brightness, freshness, and acidity in there. So we have all of France in Sonoma alone. Napa Valley is much of a warmer region, so I think if you had to compare it, it would be kind of in southern France for sure, a mixture between the left bank of Bordeaux and Rhone. Because it's a little bit warmer than the left bank of Bordeaux, but certainly Cabernet is king here in Napa, and Cabernet is certainly king there in Bordeaux as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but would you say as a California winemaker, are there any major maybe disadvantages or advantages compared to other regions around the world?
Well, I think one of the disadvantages is we are still a young region. And so I think some of the areas that might be best suited for certain varietals are still just being discovered. So maybe it is an advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you want to look at it. And in France, because they have such history in wine growing and winemaking out there, they have much stricter regulations. So that might be a disadvantage that they only allow certain varietals to be planted in certain areas. Here, there's no regulations in what you can plant. And I think one of the issues is we kind of think and plant on a grower side in a monoculture. If you're in Napa Valley or if you're in Alexander Valley, everything should be planted Cabernet because that's what you're getting the highest price point for per ton or whatever it may be if you're selling it. Where some sites are better well suited for Merlot or Malbec or Petit Verdot, or as you get cooler and cooler, you get better areas for Chardonnay, of course, as well. So there's a vast variety of things, but I think one of the huge advantages we have here in California is we're still finding gems here and planting areas that, if you look 10 years ago where some of the best Pinot Noir is being grown right now, everyone thought it was too cold. And now that's considered one of the best Pinot Noir regions in the world. Same, I think, was what will happen and happening here on the Sonoma side with Cabernet. I'm currently planting Cabernet Sauvignon in the Russian River Valley. And for those who know that area, is classically a Pinot and Chardonnay area, but it is, depending on where you are, and we're in the certainly most eastern part, so further away from the Pacific Ocean, kind of the banana belt of the Russian River. So it's a little bit warmer here, but still not as warm as you'd see in some of these other areas. But we want to plant Cabernet and other red Bordeaux varietals here to really lengthen the growing season. And so we're able to push that limit of not getting ripe too early, where you're not going to have any flavor development, where you're going to be not phenolically ripe, and you just have sugar ripeness. We might want to go on the other side of things where we know we're getting plenty of flavor, plenty of richness, and those ripe tannins, not those bitter tannins, but maybe we're not pushing the sugars as high and have alcohols a little bit more in balance as well.
It really is a science, right? It's hard work.
Mixture of science, agriculture, and art, no doubt.
Exactly. Cool. So moving on here, Daniel wants to know what your favorite barrel to work with is. And maybe you can go into a little bit more on different barrels, the types, how they can affect the wine and that sort of stuff. Sure.
Well, each cooperage is very unique in its own. As you get to know your cooperages really well, I can taste if it's been in that barrel for aging for few months or sometimes the life of the wine, and go through and taste the barrel and know exactly which barrel that is. And so we work with about 7 different cooperages, and we work very closely with a lot of cooperages that make specific barrels and specific toasts just for us. Because again, we're making styles of wines that are a little bit different than I like to think most others are. And we want oak. I love oak as an influencer, but I want it to lift the fruit and highlight it. And I think the cooperages that do the best of that for me are usually Darnajou, which is right out of Bordeaux, and Terenceau. And usually Terenceau in general is a lighter toasted barrel. Even their medium plus and heavy toasted are on the lighter side. Darnajou is a little bit more impactful, but it gives such a depth and richness to the dark fruits. So it's like having all these different spices in the kitchen. And if you just had salt as your only spice, you might season your meal a little bit differently than if you had a plethora of different spices. So that's why we work with a lot of different cooperages and multiple different toasts, so we can get different elements. So when we put the final blend together, we have all those different components to make a more compelling and more complex wine.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really cool to see like how much of a difference it can make, tasting French versus American oak, and really even with the smell, from the palate to the first smell. We like to encourage our angels to educate themselves in that way. So
absolutely, a great example, if you want an extreme opposite of what we're doing for this wine, like Silver Oak, Alexander Valley, and Napa for that matter, is all aged in American oak barrels, which to me is a much more impactful barrel. It gives a lot more kind of that dill and like more kind of like that vanilla and coconut flavors to it, which is fine, but it's just not showcasing and it's somewhat overpowering the fruit, where French oak is usually not the lead singer, it's the backup band.
Sure. Great. Let's talk a little bit about decanting, because I know there were a couple questions about it. And Jeff really just wants to know your thoughts on it. Are there specific wines? You recommended, of course, decanting exposed, but also you didn't because you opened it 5 minutes before. So what kind of differences can decanting a wine make? And what's your experience there?
Sure. I think if you're drinking any youthful Bordeaux varietal wine that has a little bit more bigger structure, I would always suggest to decant it. And especially the higher the quality, usually the more air it needs, because these wines have been very crafted to last a long, long period of time. But oxygen is a huge component of allowing the wine to open up. And when you age a wine, even if it's on the cork, it will allow a micro amount of oxygen to breathe through this cork. So it will evolve slowly, but sometimes if you're getting ready to enjoy it right then, you need a lot of oxygen. So some of those aromatics can become unbound, so that palate and those tannins can start to showcase and melt into the palate a little bit more. So it's really just a way of kind of making the wine a little bit more approachable and showcasing its true essence a little bit quicker. If you have this bottle and you taste it throughout the evening, you'll start to see as it evolves, because this is a living thing, how it can change. Decanting that will really kind of help expedite that and get it to where it's showing the best at that time, I believe. So I always suggest decanting youthful red wines. As you get older and older, oxygen is this amazing thing that can aid in wine, but can also kill a wine. So depending on if the wine is on the break of being past its prime, I might minimize the oxygen because it might lose it really quickly, because you might pull the cork, start to see a little bit of red bricking around, a little bit of oxidation there, and you might not want any more than that. But anything youthful, I would say within the first 7 to 10 years, I would suggest decanting, especially in the Cabernet red Bordeaux varietal world.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, another educational opportunity, right, for angels to maybe don't decant one vintage and decant another, and kind of tell the difference, and maybe pair it with food or don't pair it with food. Someone in the chat said, isn't exposed or any wine a meal within itself? So, and we could not agree more.
And the other thing I like to do is maybe, I'm not going to finish this wine today. So we'll just throw a cork in it, throw it in my refrigerator, and tomorrow I'll go back to it. Maybe I'll pull it out of the refrigerator refrigerator a half hour, hour before I'm getting ready to enjoy it. And with a wine like this, it might even be better tomorrow.
Yep. Great. So one of the first questions we had when you were kind of giving us a little tour of the vineyards behind you over at the property, Kathy wanted to know if the winery had any issues with California fires in the past.
Good question. We are very thankful that we've had no issues here at the estate with any structures burning or fire or anything like that. That being said, we've had to evacuate multiple different times since the very inaugural vintage here at the winery in 2019. So ever since 19 and 20, both vintages, we've had to evacuate since opening the new facility. We were making all the wines prior to me opening this new spot in Napa. But yeah, it's been very difficult for the community. We are fortunate because even when we evacuated in 2019, we were completely done with harvest when the fires came through, but we had 27 tanks of my best Cabernet of the vintage in tank. And being evacuated, these are active fermentations. But while I was talking to you earlier about those automated pump overs, my dad lives in San Francisco, I was able to evacuate to his place and keep all the fermentations going and pump them all over from my computer on while I was in his apartment. And so when I came back, we didn't miss a beat. I only had to evacuate for just over 24 hours. So we feel fortunate in that realm that none of those wines were affected by that. 2020 was a much different animal. There's two waves of fires. The first, the Woolbridge fires, were much further west of us. And those were more impactful than the glass fires that burned through Napa and then eventually came over to the Kenwood side. And I say that because we were done with harvest by the time that the second fires came through. So yes, it had an impact on the community, on a lot of our friends and family. I had friends in Napa that brought their grapes to Aperture to make their wines here because they couldn't get to their winery, or in one case, their winery burnt. But here, we were done with harvest by that time. The first fire that came through, a lot of that, what we're finding out, and unfortunately, we're doing a tremendous amount of research on this and spending tens and tens of thousands of dollars on laboratory analysis on all this stuff, is when the fires came here, and it was very early, it was August, so no one in the Cabernet world, really most red varietal world, was picking at this point, maybe some sparkling, but that's it. So you had no choice but to leave the crop out there. And so everyone was terrified with smoke affected fruit and smoke tainted wine down the road. And one of the things why I was a little bit more optimistic, and we were very diligent about doing micro ferments on every lot, and we still are keeping a close eye on everything, but the fire was to the west of us. And it was during this very, very hot period of time where we had almost a whole week stretch that here was over 100 degrees. But this fire was to the west of us. That heat, as heat air rises, was just pushing the smoke up into the air. And actually San Francisco was getting a lot of that smoke. And so it went from here, and my dad would call me and he sent me these photos. It looked all orange and looked like Armageddon there because they were getting all the smoke from us here. And then it went back out, and after research, we kind of know that it went there, went back out to the Pacific Ocean, came back in. And then about a week and a half to 2 weeks later, it ended up to our eastern vineyards. That is much less detrimental to wines, if not non-detrimental, than if the smoke burns right next to your vineyards and that fresh smoke goes into the vines right beside it. We know there's these detrimental phenols that burn or that are in smoke, and within 24 hours, most of them fall out. So if you don't have what we call unaffectionately fresh smoke coming into your vineyards within 24 hours, you are in a much better area. I think Alexander Valley will be the shining star for Cabernet producers in the 2020 vintage. But one thing that I would say across the board, that if you trust the winery, the winemaker, and they come out with a wine from 2020, I would trust that they're going to come out with a good product. No, there's going to be a lot of spectacular wines made from the 2020 vintage. Going into this vintage, similar to this one, but we knew it was actually even going to be a smaller crop. We'll see what happens with set. But we were sitting on a wine vintage. Very small crop, teeny berry. We knew it was going to be a big, rich, concentrated vintage. And then these fires happen, and fires are so sporadic. If it burns and it's right next to you, yes, massive concern. And I don't want to speak for everyone, because there will be a lot of people that will not be able to come out with the vintage that year. But for us, we felt incredibly fortunate, because most of our vineyards were far away from the fires. We did have 2 vineyards that we took insurance claims on instead of harvesting because of their proximity. Everything else that we harvested, which was about 80% of the vintage, we brought in. It was a light crop, so already we were down another 25%. So it's going to be a light crop no matter what. But throughout all the micro ferments, we're finding non-detect on most of the lots. We're monitoring anything that has anything slight. Most likely we will declassify that. And the 2020 vintage, we have some of the most rich, decadent style wines I've ever created in my career. So I would be very optimistic and trust your producer if they're going to come out with a wine. But again, there's going to be a lot of producers that won't have that option. And I think Napa really got hit. If you hadn't picked by the time that second fire went through, it could be a very difficult situation for you.
Great answer. Thanks, Jesse. So on a bit of a lighter note, do you have any aspirations to create a sparkling in the future?
No. I love sparkling, and I probably drink more champagne than any other wine, because I make big, decadent, rich red wines for the most part, and I love something light, fresh, crisp, and sparkling. But champagne does such a good job of doing it, and there's a lot of great areas. And it's also, you really need to have a custom facility for that. And I have a lot of wonderful friends that make champagne, so we trade Cabernet for champagne, and it's a win-win there.
There you go.
I'll be drinking plenty of it, but not making it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good and a bad thing, right? As long as you have the friends who make it, there you go. Great. So moving on down here, someone actually, I think, was drinking your Aperture Sauv Blanc. They were saying it's extremely memorable. Is there any sort of magic you add to it that makes it so memorable?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoy that wine. It's one of my favorites as well. And the Aperture Sauvignon Blanc is a very unique style of Sauvignon Blanc. For those who have had it or have not had it, I think you'll see there's a lot more layers and richness and complexity than most Sauvignon Blancs out there, at least in the New World, because for the most part, most Sauvignon Blancs, and you'll see a massive price difference because of this, are cropped pretty heavy in the vineyard, brought into the winery, fermented in stainless steel, and put to bottle immediately. For us, and this was really inspired from a lot of my time in Bordeaux, while I was really mostly studying on the right bank of Bordeaux at Chateau Petrus, this overlapped when my father was doing his book on the first growths of Bordeaux. So Scott has spent a lot of time on the left bank of Bordeaux and at some of these most famed wineries on the planet, in particular at Haut-Brion. And Haut-Brion Blanc was coming in while I was able to be there. So I got to see their attention to detail in the farming of Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, which Aperture has some Semillon blended in there as well. All their Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon is barrel fermented, very specific barrels that were just custom made for Haut-Brion. So took all these little pieces, found one of the most spectacular vineyard sites for Sauvignon Blanc in California. There's been more accolades out of this Sauvignon Blanc vineyard than any other one, called Dry Stack Vineyard. And so it's all coming from this very cool site out in Bennett Valley. We barrel fermented some of these custom barrels that Haut-Brion was using, which are all French oak bodies of the barrel. So all the staves are French oak, but the heads are actually toasted acacia wood. We use those for about 10 to 15% of the new oak for that vintage. So you'll see there's a lot of complexity in this wine. There's this amazing richness and creaminess to it, but it still has this amazing acidity. A wine that has so much tension that if you just have the acidity without that richness, it would be very angular. If you just have the richness, it'd be a little flabby and non-focused. Put them together and it's something quite unique. So I encourage everyone to give that a whirl as well. And if you opened up last month's Spectator, they had a whole thing on the new wave of California Sauvignon Blanc, and we were front and center photo of that.
There you go. All right. So really great question that came through from Corey. Are you ever surprised by your finished product, or do you really control the art and the science and everything that goes into it? Do you, let me reread, hold on. The art and science, and do you know every part of the winemaking process will impact the taste, the final wine, or do certain influences ever catch you by surprise? Is it always what you expect, or does it come out a little bit different?
Well, every vintage will run some experiments. Maybe that's working with a new cooperage, new toast, new fermentation temperature, style, vessel, whatever it may be. So we're constantly running experiments. And that being said, we get one try of this a year. So we can't, these are relatively small lot fermentations, small quantities. And then as we start to see how those affect the wine, some will start to implement into our protocols. So yes, there's certain times that a new cooperage or a new vessel or new fermentation temperature, whatever it may be, might have an effect that I wasn't really anticipating. But that's the main part. Usually a lot of these vineyards I've worked with for many, many years, we'll have a pretty good idea of the level of that quality going in. And also you have to think about, to make this bottle of wine is a 2-year process. And so it's not just harvest, put it to barrel, and then top it here and there and go back to it. We're constantly analyzing it, tasting it, changing the vessels that it's in, changing the oak regime that it's in, sometimes giving it a lot of air, sometimes being really reductive. So we can kind of guide the wine and the textures that we're looking at. So by the time I get ready for bottling, there's no surprises. Maybe a couple fun ones during harvest, but never during bottling. You don't want any surprises during bottling.
Great answer. Thank you. Couple more here. What share of your grapes are used? Do you source externally versus grow yourself, if any?
Expose is all external grapes that we work with some of the famed growers around here. Aperture is almost all internal. And that's a mixture of estate grapes and leased grapes as well.
Cool. Is there a favorite step in the winemaking process that you have?
I love winemaking, and one of the reasons why I love it is it's changes throughout the season. So right now we're putting a lot of the blends together. So I love blending time because you get to kind of take not only all these different varietals and different lots and different press fractions and different barrels and coopers and stuff to create something unique and distinct, but it's also kind of taking that vintage and seeing all those different subtle things that we tweaked throughout and how it has gotten to that place. So this is really exciting. I love blending. I love harvest. Harvest is probably my favorite time of year because you have so much going on in the vineyard where you can have a huge effect. I spend about 80% of my time in the vineyard during harvest. And so there's a massive effect you can have in the vineyard and making sure that you're picking it at the optimal time, that you're not missing anything out there, that you're giving an ample stress, but too much. So there's fine tuning in the vineyard. And then in the winemaking side of things, it's such an exciting time to kind of see what that vintage identity will be, whether it's going to be a more tannic year, a lighter year, more floral, there's all those things. And as you start to get in your first couple of lots, you really kind of have that understanding and can help guide and tweak your winemaking protocols to showcase the best of that vintage. So it's hard for me. I love it all.
All of it. Awesome.
Harvest and blending, those would be my two answers.
Okay. Well, yeah, and like Jesse, like you said before, I mean, visiting in harvest is really spectacular and just kind of seeing the whole process firsthand. So anyone who gets the opportunity to do that, definitely recommend doing that.
Absolutely.
All right, we just have 2 more here. What parts of biodynamic winemaking have you adopted, if any? Why or why not?
So every single vineyard that we work with in the winery is all certified sustainable. We utilize a lot of organic practices and we use some of the compost elements in biodynamics. So yes, I think some of the elements they're working with, in particular in their teas and in their compost, are very valuable. And really what we're looking for is microbial life in the soils. And I think that's the key part. And so we're looking at that closely. Because of labor and how many vineyards that I'm farming and working with to do the manure and the horns and plant that under would make the bottle probably 20-30% more expensive. And I don't know if we would see that return on that. So we use kind of some of the best parts. I worked at fully certified biodynamic vineyards in the past, and it was a wonderful experience, but it's not something that I saw every element needing to pass on to our attention to detail in viticulture. I think we can kind of morph organics, sustainability, and biodynamics into a practice that is a little bit more specific to each vineyard site.
Right. And last but certainly not least, before we wrap up here, John says, your Devil Proof Malbec is spectacular. Can you share any details about its production?
Oh, teeny little production. We have 2 single vineyard dry farm hillside Malbec sites. And 2012 was the very first vintage of that. And from the very first vintage on, we've been the highest rated Malbec in the history of California every vintage. It's a teeny little production. We usually sell out within 24 hours when we release it. And yeah, I wish we had more of that spectacular fruit, but it's a very small. I'm in the Devil Proof room. That's the photo that we use. This amazing woman who I got to know in Cuba. One of my father's most famous photos that have been in galleries and museums all over the world. And yeah, what else can I say? It's such a, I wish I got to drink more of it. I love that one.
That's awesome. And I lied. I do have a question, and we can end on this, but what's any goals or what you're excited for with finally being on board with Naked, and any other varietals potentially in the future for Angels?
Yeah, we got a couple other things up our sleeve. We're definitely going to do a Pinot Noir this year. And I love making Pinot Noir. I consult for a couple brands that make Pinot Noir as well. But this is from a really special vineyard out in the Russian River. Chardonnay looks like we'll do something as well, like it will be barrel fermented, barrel aged, very beautiful, like mineral acidity driven style of Chardonnay. It won't be this too oaky or too overblown style, kind of going back to my Burgundian roots from living out there. So those are the main 2. There might be a couple other things. So it's always a fun experiment to continue to work through, but definitely those 2, and continuing to focus on the beautiful Cabernet sites that we're working with for exposed cab.
Awesome. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for being here. I'm sure the Angels can say the same. Angels, thank you for being here. We are so excited to have you on board in the family. And as Christy put in the chat already, head over to Jesse's page, let him know what you think of the wine, and engage with him. We're just really excited to have you and what you're going to bring to the Naked portfolio. And again, Angels, anything as we continue to do these awesome tastings in the future, if there's anything you want to see, anything different, you can always find us on social media or chat us in. But Jesse, thank you again.
Thank you all. It's been a true honor, and really excited to work with you all a lot more. And thank you, Angels, for supporting. This has been a dream come true, and I can't wait to hear your input and what you're cooking with this wine. Cheers, everyone.
See y'all soon.